Chapter 3 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4 by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 3, The Fall of Sumter. President Lincoln, in deciding the Sumter question, had adopted a simple but effective policy. To use his own words, he determined to send bread to Anderson. If the rebels fired on that, they would not be able to convince the world that he had begun civil war. All danger of misapprehension, all accusations of invasion and subjugation would fall to the ground before that paramount duty, not only to the nation, but to humanity. This was universal statesmanship reduced to its simplest expression. To this end, he had ordered the relief expedition to sail and sent open notice to Governor Pickens of its coming. His own duty thus discharged, no less in kindness than in honesty, the American people would take care of the result. That he by this time expected resistance and hostilities, though unrecorded, is reasonably certain. The presence of armed ships with the expedition and their instructions to fight their way to the fort in case of opposition show that he believed the arbitrament of the sword to be at hand. His authorization to Anderson to capitulate after the ordinary risks of war is evidence that he did not expect a decisive battle or a conclusive victory. Whether the expedition would fail or succeed was a question of minor importance. He was not playing a game of military strategy with Beauregard. He was looking through Sumter to the loyal states, beyond the insulted flag to the avenging nation. The rebels, on their part, had only a choice of evils. Their scheme of peaceable secession demanded incompatible conditions: the union of the South and the division of the North. If they set war in motion, they would lose their Democratic allies in the free states. If they hesitated to fight, the revolution would collapse in the slave states. As usual on such occasions, rash advice carried the day. Said an uncompromising fire-eater to Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, "Unless you sprinkle blood in the face of the people of Alabama, they will be back in the old Union in less than 10 days." The possibility that Sumter might be relieved by boats on a dark night evidently decided the rebel authorities to order an immediate attack on the fort. They could not afford the risk of its successful defense. Its capture was necessary to the life of the rebellion. Therefore, on the 10th of April, they telegraphed to Beauregard, "If you have no doubt of the authorized character of the agent who communicated to you the intention of the Washington government to supply Fort Sumter by force, you will at once demand its evacuation, and if this is refused, proceed in such manner as you may determine to reduce it." At 2 p.m. on the 11th, that officer accordingly made the demand, offering facilities to remove the troops with their arms and private property, and the privilege of saluting their flag. The demand was laid before a council of officers who voted a unanimous refusal. "I have the honor," thereupon replied Anderson, "to acknowledge the receipt of your communication demanding the evacuation of this fort, and to say in reply thereto that it is a demand with which I regret that my sense of honor and of my obligations to my government prevent my compliance," at the same time thanking him for his compliments and courteous terms. The rebel aides-de-camp who bore these messages engaged in informal conversation with Anderson, in the course of which, with somewhat careless freedom, he said to them, "Gentlemen, if you do not batter the fort to pieces about us, we shall be starved out in a few days." The phrase was telegraphed to Montgomery, whence instructions came back once more to offer time to deliver up the fort. Whereupon, near midnight of the 11th, Beauregard again wrote, "If you will state the time at which you will evacuate Fort Sumter, and agree that in the meantime you will not use your guns against us unless ours shall be employed against Fort Sumter, we will abstain from opening fire upon you." It was long past midnight when the aides reached the fort and handed this second message to Anderson. Anderson, in return, submitted to them the following proposition in writing: "I will, if provided with the proper and necessary means of transportation, evacuate Fort Sumter by noon on the 15th instant, should I not receive prior to that time controlling instructions from my government or additional supplies, and that I will not in the meantime open my fire upon your forces unless compelled to do so by some hostile act against this fort or the flag of my government, by the forces under your command, or by some portion of them, or by the perpetration of some act showing a hostile intention on your part against this fort or the flag it bears." This cautious and resolute answer was not what the rebel commander desired, but apparently he expected nothing else, for he had given his aides discretionary authority to refuse the stipulation. They retired to an adjoining room to consult and compose their answer, and at 20 minutes past 3 o'clock on the morning of Friday, April 12, 1861, handed Anderson their written notice that the rebel batteries would open their fire upon the fort in 1 hour. Then, taking leave, they entered their boat and proceeded directly to Fort Johnson, and gave to the officer commanding that post the order to open fire at the time indicated. Unwelcome as was the prospect of the impending conflict, it must in one sense have been a relief, as a contrast to the uncertainty in which the fate of the garrison had hung for more than 3 months. The decisive moment of action was at last reached, and the spirit and strength of every inmate of the fort leaped into new life under the impulse of combat. Until the full dawning of the morning, nothing could be done within the fort. Anderson gave the necessary orders about the coming attack. The sentinels were all withdrawn from their exposed stations on the parapet. Every gate and opening was closed. The men were strictly enjoined not to leave the shelter of the casemates except on special summons. These few preparations hastily completed, Sumter seemed to the outside world to have relapsed into the security and silence of a peaceful sleep. The fort had been built on an artificial island midway in the mouth of Charleston Harbor. It was 3 miles from the city, but projecting points of the neighboring islands enclosed it in a triangle. On these the rebels had built their siege works. To the northeast, Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, distant 1,800 yards. To the south, the Cummings Point batteries on Morris Island, distant 1,300 yards. To the west, Fort Johnson on James Island, distant 2,500 yards. Some were built merely to oppose the expected reinforcements through the harbor channels. Most of them were earthworks. 2 were constructed of wood and protected with railroad iron. One of these had been designed to serve as a floating battery, but proving a failure in this object, was now advantageously grounded behind a protecting seawall. Altogether, there were from 14 to 19 of these batteries, mounting a total of 30 guns and 17 mortars, manned and supported by a volunteer force of 4,000 to 6,000 men. The greater part were holiday soldiers, but among their officers were a dozen or two formerly belonging to the Federal Army and possessed of a thorough military education. To these the management of the enterprise was mainly confided. Fort Sumter was a scarcely completed work, dating back to the period of smooth-bore guns of small caliber. Its walls were of brick, 40 feet high and 8 feet thick. It was pierced for 140 guns, to be mounted in 2 tiers of casemates and on the parapet. But when Anderson inspected it on his arrival in November previous, the brickwork of walls and casemates was still unfinished, and only a few guns were mounted. Foster, the engineer in charge, had, with limited help and materials, and in the face of constant obstacles and discouragements, pushed the work towards completion. There was now a total of 48 guns mounted and ready for use, though furnished with very rude and insufficient appliances. Of these, 21 were in the casemates and 27 on the parapet. To man and support them, Anderson had a garrison of 9 commissioned officers, 68 non-commissioned officers and privates, 8 musicians, and 43 non-combatant laborers, a total of 128 souls. We shall see that while the opposing artillery was nearly equal in number, there existed in fact a great disparity in its quality. Not only was Anderson's fire diffused and that of the enemy concentrated, but the rebels had 17 10-inch mortars which could deliver a vertical fire and drop large shells into the fort, while Anderson had nothing to answer them but the horizontal fire of his guns to throw missiles against the face of the rebel bomb-proofs, formed of heavy sandbanks or sloping railroad iron. The inhabitants of Charleston were informed of the intended bombardment. Months of speech-making, drilling, and war preparation had excited an intense eagerness to witness the fight. In the yet prevailing darkness, they came pouring out of their houses by a common impulse and thronged to the wharves and buildings on the bay, where they sought advantageous positions to behold the long-wished-for spectacle. At about 4:30, as the dim outline of Fort Sumter began to define itself in the morning twilight, they saw a shell rise from the mortar batteries near Fort Johnson and make its slow and graceful curve upon Sumter. This was the signal. Gun after gun and battery after battery responded to its summons, and in less than an hour all the besieging works were engaged in an active cannonade. Inside of Sumter, the garrison received the attack with a certain degree of deliberation. The first care was to note the effect of the firing. The opening shots of the rebels were badly aimed and fell wide of the mark. With the advancing daylight, their gunners obtained a better range. The solid shot began to strike the face of the wall, and the shells from the mortars to explode with alarming precision over the parapet. Nevertheless, no great damage was done. One vital point was, however, quickly decided. Housed in the casemates, the garrison was comparatively safe. But out on the unprotected parapet, under the concentrated fire of all the rebel artillery, Anderson's little handful of cannoneers would melt away like frost in the morning sun. With a full war garrison, he could have replaced officers and men as they were shot down, but with only sufficient trained force to work 9 guns, he dared not risk the loss of a single man. His first reluctant duty, therefore, was to order the abandonment of all his barbette guns. These were 27 in number, more than half his available armament, and comprising nearly all his pieces of large caliber. Through this necessity alone, Fort Sumter was largely shorn of its offensive power. His 21 casemate guns, of which only 4 were 42-pounders and the remainder 32s, constituted the total of his fighting artillery. The rations of bread having been exhausted a day or two before, the command breakfasted on pork and water. and at about 7 o'clock Captain Abner Doubleday, the ranking officer, took his station at a casemate gun and opened fire with a solid shot against the formidable ironclad battery on Cummings Point. Fully roused by the combined excitements of resentment and danger, the men sprang with alacrity to their duty. Even the 43 engineer workmen, forgetting their character of non-combatants, volunteered and rendered active service in the defense. In fact, the enthusiasm of the garrison somewhat outstripped its prudence. They began the engagement with a supply of only 700 cartridges. By the middle of the day, this stock had become so much reduced that the fort was compelled to slacken its fire. From this time, only 6 guns were kept in action, 2 towards Morris Island, 2 towards Fort Moultrie, and 2 towards the batteries on the west end of Sullivan's Island. These were also fired at longer intervals, while the only 6 needles in the fort were kept busy sewing up cartridge bags out of the extra clothing, blankets, hospital sheets, and even coarse paper. So the unequal combat went on throughout the first day. The journal of the bombardment kept by Captain Foster shows that no very decisive damage was effected on either side. From the fort there were occasional good shots. The ironclad batteries were repeatedly struck, but the light balls bounded off their sloping roofs. At other batteries they buried themselves harmlessly in the rebel sandbanks. Embrasures were struck, groups of rebel officers and men, allowing their curiosity to draw them out from their shelter, hustled pell-mell back into their bomb-proofs. An incautious schooner, receiving a ball, hauled down her Confederate flag and hurried out of range. The 2 42-pounders bearing on Moultrie silenced a gun, riddled the barracks and quarters, and tore 3 holes through the rebel flag. Foster's report says, "The effect of the enemy's fire upon Fort Sumter during the day was very marked in respect to the vertical fire. This was so well directed and so well sustained that from the 17 mortars engaged in firing 10-inch shells, 1/2 of the shells came within or exploded above the parapet of the fort, and only about 10 buried themselves in the soft earth of the parade without exploding. The effect of the direct fire from the enemy's guns was not so marked as the vertical. For several hours' firing from the commencement, a large proportion of their shot missed the fort. Subsequently it improved and did considerable damage to the roof and upper story of the barracks and quarters, and to the tops of the chimneys on the gorge. The shots from the guns in the batteries on the west end of Sullivan's Island did not produce any considerable direct effect, but many of them took the gorge in reverse in their fall, completely riddling the officers' quarters even down to the first story, so great was the angle of fall of many of the balls." One additional danger manifested itself. 3 times during the day the wooden buildings in the fort caught fire, but were extinguished without great difficulty, being low and easily accessible. The rebel batteries, provided with several furnaces, now and then fired a hot shot, but whether these or bursting shells started the burning, the officers could not determine. The very work of ruin going on in the building used as officers' quarters aided in restraining the flames. The hallways were provided with iron water tanks, which, being soon perforated by cannon balls, deluged the chambers and rendered the woodwork difficult to ignite. Amid experience of this kind, the eventful 12th of April, the first day of the Sumter bombardment, drew to a close. The fire of Sumter ceased, the direct fire of the rebel batteries slackened and was finally discontinued. Only the mortars kept up a slow and sullen bombardment through the night at intervals of from 10 to 15 minutes. The work of sewing up cartridge bags was continued until midnight. Sentinels and lookouts were stationed to watch for the possible coming of boats from the fleet, or of boats bearing a storming party from the rebel camps. But the night proved dark and rainy, with a continuance of the prevailing gale, making the waters of the harbor too rough for either of these undertakings. Under cover of the thick gloom, Foster, the engineer, ventured outside the walls and satisfied himself by personal inspection that the exterior of the work was not damaged to any considerable extent, and that all the facilities for taking in supplies in case they arrived were as complete as circumstances would admit. 3 United States men of war had been seen off the bar during the afternoon, and the fort had dipped its flag in signal to them. What was the fleet doing? The several vessels of the Fox expedition were scarcely at sea when they encountered a driving gale. Captain Fox himself, who sailed in the Baltic on the morning of the 9th, was yet ignorant of the changed destination of the flagship Powhatan. This was doubtless an entirely unintentional omission, arising out of the cross purposes and system of profound secrecy which for a few days prevailed at Washington. The Baltic reached the rendezvous off Charleston just in time to hear the opening guns of the bombardment. The Harriet Lane was already there. The Pawnee arrived at daylight. There was an apparent conflict of orders and a hesitation to cooperate. The Baltic and the Harriet Lane stood in to offer to carry provisions to the fort, but as they neared the bar of the harbor, they saw by the quick flashing rebel guns that the war was already begun. At this intelligence, the commander of the Pawnee declared his intention to go in and share the fate of his brethren of the army. Fox, cool and practical, brought him back to reason by explaining the government instructions, and induced him to await the chance of rendering more effective service. The 2 ships of war anchored near the bar, and the Baltic stood off and on to await the arrival of the Powhatan and the tugs. This, however, was a vain hope. The Powhatan was on her way to Pensacola. The tugs had been scattered by the storm. The Freeborn was not permitted to leave New York. The Uncle Ben was driven into Wilmington and fell into the hands of the rebels. The Yankee failed to reach the rendezvous till long after the affair was over. But, ignorant of these disasters and hoping hourly for the arrival of the missing vessels, the fleet waited and made signals all the long afternoon and through the dark and stormy night, while the lookouts in the garrison were anxiously scanning the turbulent waters of the bay for the coming of the boats, and the rebel gunners stood by their channel batteries in the drenching rain, hoping to intercept and sink them. Captain Fox and the officers of the fleet were sorely disappointed at the non-arrival of the Powhatan and the tugs. The former had on board the armed launches and the necessary sailors to man them. The tugs were to have carried the supplies and perhaps drawn the boats in tow. With these facilities for transportation, there is every probability that they would have reached the fort. The storm was both an advantage and a hindrance. It increased the friendly darkness to hide them from the rebel gunners, but at the same time it lashed the waters of the bay into fury. When morning came, such had been the pitchy gloom of the night and the roaring of the rain and the surf that the commanders of the rebel batteries were unable to report that their watch and guard had been completely effective. Opinions differ, wrote one of their best officers, as to whether anything got into Sumter last night. They may or may not. The night was dark and occasionally stormy, and a heavy sea running. If anything did, it could not have been very extensive. With the morning of the 13th, Captain Fox and the officers began to despair of the Powhatan and the tugs. Unwilling to remain mere spectators of the fight, they cast about to use such expedients as presented themselves. Among the merchant vessels by this time collected at the bar, awaiting the issue of the contest, was an ice schooner. This they impressed and began to prepare for an attempt to enter the following night. There were plenty of volunteers among both officers and seamen for the hazardous duty, but long before nightfall the bombardment had come to an end. That Captain Fox's undertaking thus terminated without direct practical result was not his fault. With characteristic generosity and truthfulness, President Lincoln took upon himself the principal blame for its failure. He wrote to Fox soon afterwards, "The practicability of your plan was not in fact brought to a test. By reason of a gale well known in advance to be possible and not improbable, the tugs, an essential part of the plan, never reached the ground. while by an accident for which you were in no wise responsible, and possibly I to some extent was, you were deprived of a war vessel with her men, which you deemed of great importance to the enterprise. You and I both anticipated that the cause of the country would be advanced by making the attempt to provision Fort Sumter, even if it should fail. And it is no small consolation now to feel that our anticipation is justified by the result. Fort Sumter opened early and spitefully, and paid especial attention to Fort Moultrie, almost every shot grazing the crest of the parapet and crashing through the quarters. This was the rebel report of the beginning of the second day's bombardment, April 13. The garrison of Sumter was refreshed by a night of comparatively secure rest in their casemates, and no doubt a hearty breakfast of pork and water, and so long as the stock of cartridges made up during the night held out, they kept up so brisk a fire from their few guns that the rebels began to be confirmed in the opinion that the fort had really been reinforced. On their side, the besiegers also increased both the speed of firing and their accuracy of aim, and seeing that they were making no headway in the test of breaching the walls, they began to pay more attention to the use of red-hot shot. Thus far, this unequal contest of nearly 50 concentrating guns, replied to by about 6, had gone on without material damage to either party, showing, in proportion to the strength of each, nothing but indented brick walls or displaced sandbags, battered chimneys and perforated barracks, a few slight contusions from splinters, and 1 or 2 disabled guns. According to all the reports, it might have proceeded at this rate the whole week, and the waste of ammunition would have been its most serious feature. But at this stage a new element entered into the strife, and soon turned the fortune of the day against the unlucky garrison of Sumter. At about 9 o'clock in the morning, the roof of the officers' quarters once more caught fire, either from a bursting shell or a red-hot shot, and this time the distance from water and the exposure to the enemy's missiles made it impossible to extinguish the flames. Worse than all, it quickly became evident that the fire would soon encircle the magazine and make it imperative to close it. At Captain Foster's suggestion, all hands not employed at the guns sprang to the work of taking out a supply of powder. About 50 barrels were thus secured, distributed for safety in the various casemates, and covered with wet blankets, when the fire and heat so far increased that it was necessary to close the heavy metal door of the magazine and bank it up with earth. The enemy, observing the smoke, redoubled the fire of the batteries. A strong south wind carried the flames to all the barracks inside the fort, and though the men fought the advance of the fire, they were at length compelled to give way and take refuge in the casemates. Even here they were not safe. The course of the wind was such as to fill every nook and corner of the fort with blinding, stifling smoke. The men crouched close down to the floors, covered their faces with wet handkerchiefs, or took exposed stations near the embrasures to obtain a breath of fresh air. As if this were not enough, a still subtler danger pursued them. The rapid conflagration and sweeping wind had filled the air with fire flakes, and these drifted on the strong currents and countercurrents into the casemates to such an extent as to ignite the beds, boxes, and various small articles hastily collected there. Under such circumstances, the 50 barrels of powder saved with so much exertion from the magazine could no longer be kept, and, upon Anderson's order, all but 5 barrels were thrown through the embrasures of the fort into the sea. Noon had meanwhile come, and engaged in these pressing occupations, the garrison had ceased firing. By and by the wind changed a little, rendering the situation somewhat safer and more comfortable. There were but few cartridges left. Still an occasional shot was fired, which the rebels themselves, roused to admiration of the garrison, received with cheers. A new incident now engaged general attention. The flagstaff of the fort, struck 7 times during the first day and 3 the second, fell at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Lieutenant Snyder and a couple of men, without much delay, again hoisted the flag on a jury mast extemporized on the parapet. The rebels had, however, noted the fall of the flag and sent several communications to Sumter. The first messenger was the ubiquitous and eccentric Senator Wigfall. He was a colonel on the staff of Beauregard, who sent him for special duty to the commander of Morris Island. From there, after a short consultation among the rebel officers, he was dispatched to Fort Sumter to make inquiries. He crossed the bay dramatically in an open boat, with his handkerchief tied to his sword for a flag of truce, and clambered up the wall to an accessible embrasure, where, one account says, an astonished artilleryman, seeing this unique apparition, summarily made him a prisoner of war. Officers soon came, however, and after a somewhat spirited dialogue and some further waving of Wigfall's sword and handkerchief out of an embrasure to which the rebel batteries paid no attention, he was taken into Anderson's presence. He made a complimentary speech to Anderson, requesting that hostilities might be suspended and terms of evacuation arranged. What then occurred, Captain Foster reports as follows. The commanding officer desiring to know what terms he came to offer, Mr. Wigfall replied, "Any terms that you may desire, your own terms, the precise nature of which General Beauregard will arrange with you." The commanding officer then accepted the conditions, saying that the terms he accepted were those proposed by General Beauregard on the 11th, namely, to evacuate the fort with his command, taking arms and all private and company property, saluting the United States flag as it was lowered, and being conveyed, if he desired it, to any northern port. With this understanding, Mr. Wigfall left, and the white flag was raised and the United States flag lowered by order of the commanding officer. The officious Wigfall had not been gone a great while when two messages arrived at Sumter from General Beauregard, the first to inquire whether Anderson needed assistance, and the second to tender him the use of a fire engine and the services of a surgeon, both of which had been brought from the city. All of these Anderson declined with thanks, saying he had no wounded, that the fire was by this time nearly burned out, and that he thought the magazine safe. From these interviews, Anderson now learned that Beauregard was entirely ignorant of Wigfall's mission or his own capitulation. He explained the circumstances and threatened to hoist his flag again. He was persuaded, however, first to submit the matter to be fully reported at headquarters. General Beauregard, after some parley, ratified Wigfall's unauthorized proceeding and accepted Anderson's terms in detail. By 8 o'clock on Saturday evening, the capitulation was definitely arranged, and on the following day, Sunday, April 14, Anderson and his command sailed northward in the Baltic, which had come to the relief of Sumter. In the bombardment of Sumter, the insurgents for the third time made active, aggressive war upon the United States. Even if we leave out of sight the occupation of forts by simple entrance or by the show of force, the building of batteries to menace Sumter, and receiving the surrender made by Twiggs in Texas. In fact, since the 27th of December, a continued series of acts had been perpetrated by them, not only outraging the authority of, but levying actual war against the United States. The rebels indulged in great rejoicing over their victory. Charleston, which had for 2 days witnessed the bombardment almost en masse, was once more vociferous with speeches and ablaze with bonfires, while at Montgomery the insurgent Secretary of War ordered an official salute to celebrate the capture and to emphasize his prediction of the previous evening that the rebel flag would float over the dome of the old Capitol at Washington before the 1st of May. Looking back now at the events of the first month of Lincoln's administration, we must wonder at the impression which prevailed then, and which has so often been expressed by impulsive men since, that he was too slow in making his decision to provision and reinforce Fort Sumter. We find that on the 15th of March, only 10 days after his first information about the condition of the fort, he formally asked the written opinion of his cabinet on the subject, and that on the 6th of April, only 3 weeks later, he gave his final order that the expedition should proceed on its mission. The intervening time was spent by him in consulting his cabinet and his military and naval officers about possible plans for relief and reinforcement. about alternative policies to be pursued, watching the culminating treason in the South and the slowly swelling loyalty in the North, awaiting the end of the contradictory words and acts of the Virginia Convention, whose majority protested unionism in public and at last voted secession in secret, using the delay which the rebels supposed they had contrived for their own benefit for preparing the Sumter expedition, making the individual members of his cabinet responsible to the party and to the country for the advice they gave, and by all this gaining a coveted choice of position and allowing the rebels to attack and thus consolidate the North. When he finally gave the order that the fleet should sail, he was master of the situation, master of his cabinet, master of the moral attitude and issues of the struggle, master of the public opinion which must arise out of the impending conflict, master if the rebels hesitated or repented because they would thereby forfeit their prestige with the South, master if they persisted, for he would then command a united North. And all this was done, it must be remembered, not in the retirement which gives calm reflection, but after the rush and hurry of a triumphal journey and the parade of an inauguration, in the confusion of conflicting counsel, the worry of preliminary appointments, the prevalence of an atmosphere of treason and insurrection, and the daily defection of government officials. In the face of such self-assertion and victory, the final verdict can never be that he was tardy or remiss. To have acted more peremptorily in that strange crisis, when all men's minds were simply groping and drifting, would have brought upon him the just criticism of recklessness. No act of his will gain him greater credit than his kindly forbearance and patient wisdom in allowing full time and reflection for the ultimate decision at this supreme juncture. He had said in his inaugural, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors." This promise to the South he kept in its most vital spirit and meaning. An autocratic ruler might have acted more arbitrarily, but in a representative government it would have been imprudent to do otherwise than to await and rely upon the slow but mighty anger of an outraged patriotism. End of chapter 3.